So with David Ricardo, we have basically another classical economist responding to the work of Adam Smith, right? And so we saw certainly with Malthus, we saw even to some extent with Bentham, these economists trying to find some ways to talk about things. And so for us, especially for the textbook with chapter 7, deals now directly with the Ricardian system. So the question would be who's David Ricardo himself? Well, here he is his picture, but what makes him different fundamentally than Adam Smith is that whereas Adam Smith kind of thought of the market as having some harmony, and that the market made society become more harmonious, David Ricardo didn't see that at all. That basically for David Ricardo, he basically saw two groups against each other. And that would be the industrialists, that would be those who were kind of busy with their factories and, kind of trying to make kind of promote the market as much as they could. And then countering the industrialists would be the landowners who basically owned land and resources, and that these two groups are then kind of battling against each other. And David Ricardo is writing at a time when England was transitioning from being a country that was growing more food than it needed to having to start to import food, which obviously got us from the one standpoint, got us our discussion of Malthus, who is kind of predicting the end of the world because England was having to bring in so much. But for Ricardo, what it did is it got him to start to think about what are the nature of rents. And that's when you talk here about chapter 7 and what the Ricardian system does, is we actually get a more a better treatment of what rent is. We get a theory of land rent, and we get rent formally defined by David Ricardo, as the textbook even highlights here, as this payment for the original and indestructible powers of the soil. So that basically there's value in the land, in what rent represents is a payment for that rent. That rent represents a payment for the value that's in that land. Okay, so with that, yes, he was quite analytical. He as a person himself, he was just highly respected. He had an analytical mind, and he just sought truth wherever it may be, even if it was counter to his own interests. So he was known as having a lot of integrity. He had immigrated to England from the Netherlands in 1760, and so then obviously, 16 years after Adam Smith is writing Wealth of Nations. And, Ricardo as a person had always felt marginalized in society. Marginalized as a person because, the Ricardos were Spanish and Portuguese Jews who then, during the Spanish Inquisition, had basically fled to the Netherlands. And then obviously, by the time we get to 1760, that would be where David Ricardo was leaving for England. David Ricardo's father had started a rather large stock brokerage firm in London, and then Ricardo took that over. And Ricardo ended up, it shows you back in the day here, the idea of a Unitarian marrying a Quaker caused Ricardo to kind of be disowned by his father, and caused part of a disturbance between the two. And yet, unlike his father, David Ricardo ended up being quite successful in managing the stock market. And then, as a person who was obviously very entrenched in the markets, like other wealthy people, he became interested in the ideas of Adam Smith with Wealth of Nations. He came across Wealth of Nations in 1799, so almost a full, almost 25 years after it had been written. And at the same time, he had read Malthus's work, that essay on population that had become pretty popular at that same time. And so here's Ricardo trying to understand both Malthus and Smith, and at the time also talking a great deal with John Stuart Mill, James Mill, who we'll talk about in the next chapter. So that's kind of where David Ricardo, where we can kind of place him. And so he starts his writings on working on first on the price of gold, then publishing The High Price of Bullion. And then, after writing those, he gets in closer contact with Malthus, and that gets him to start talking more about agriculture, and gets him more talking about the Corn Laws, which we'll talk about kind of later in this set of lectures. And so that's the big thing. The Corn Laws is what gets David Ricardo more into talking about policy and legislation. And it was the idea that corn had just become really, really expensive. And again, we have this battle going on in England at the time between the industrialists and the owners of land. And so the government decided that they were going to create an import duty on corn. The argument being that this was going to make British landed classes, or the farmers of England, just basically grow more corn, or give more money to those who grow corn domestically, right? Because the idea would be that an import duty would make imported corn more expensive, right? So from the government's perspective, they were like, problem solved. You'd have had individuals like Malthus being in favor of that, because for Malthus, if you let foreign grain come in, it's going to make corn cheaper, and it's going to cause the population to grow, and it's just going to make it so that everyone is poor. So the idea was, again, with the Corn Law, was make the corn that comes from abroad more expensive, to make it, to make an incentive for others to grow corn domestically. Again, there's our debate. Ricardo and Malthus debating these corn laws. The capitalists just want cheap corn. The landlords want higher priced corn. So who's going to win, right? That's the battle. We don't have strong enough economic thought yet from even Malthus or Ricardo. We really just have a lot of individuals either having an ancient belief in the mercantilist, possibly, but you also have a strong belief in Adam Smith and the power of the market. And so you get two counter pamphlets. Look at these titles, guys. And these are some hardcore titles. You've got Malthus writing an inquiry into the nature and progress of rent and its principles by which it's regulated. So you've got Malthus talking about this concept of, like, what is rent? And then you've got the grounds of an opinion on the policy of restricting importation of foreign corn, right? A very mercantilist belief, or just at least what's our counter to the Adam Smith principle. And then you've got Ricardo actually having by pamphlet a conversation with Malthus. Basically, this is Ricardo writing an essay that makes remarks on Malthus's previous two pamphlets. And so, we take from this idea that Malthus and Ricardo are having these, opinions, that Malthus and Ricardo are having these counter views of whether corn should be higher in price or lower in price. Malthus arguing that it should be higher in price because it's going to encourage domestic producers, to be either more efficient, more productive. It's going to stop this race to the bottom. So prices for corn should be higher. We should have these restrictions. We should have a tax on imported corn. Ricardo being against it. Ricardo arguing that essentially if corn prices are higher, then profits will be lower. If profits are lower, then those who own the land will not face a great incentive to accumulate capital, to make their land continue to be productive. What this debate requires then, is a greater discussion of what does it mean to have rents? What does it mean to earn a rent from producing corn, or growing any agricultural good for that matter? For Ricardo, his theory of rent then requires him to talk about, to hold three assumptions. That rent comes from this idea that we're getting something from the land. And that as we grow things on extended land, land that is not as productive as other bits of land, then that land won't generate as much rent. So it's capitalists and workers that work with the land with tools, and that those tools, one of those tools being the land and the productivity contained within it, the resources contained within it, that we can extract that value. And that from the perspective then of the rent, what we have to do is find the best way to extract that value from the land. That if we overplant the land, then overplanting the land means less rent, which means less profits, which means less incentive you have to try to grow things productively. Why would the landed class want to invest in growing corn effectively if it's not going to generate a very high price? They wouldn't. So again, if we wanted to look at that graphically, right, what we would see is that as I use more and more land, that the farther reaches of that land generates less and less rent. That you want to have corn be higher priced so that you encourage people to use the most fertile land. And that the difference then, what's not captured by rents should be captured as either profits or wages. And those are the three resources, right? So that is what we see today when we look at, that is what we see when we look at how resources are compensated. Workers get wages, owners of capital get rent, and then I guess in this case the ones that bring it all together, they get the profits. They bring in the wages and the rents, or they combine the wages and the rents together. So I thought this was interesting. So I thought this is a pretty good summary of his corn model, because again, you're not reading his corn You're not reading his corn pamphlets in this class. I mean, I guess you could. I'm not going to stop you. But he basically has a 7-step corn model. 3 classes in the world, right? 3 classes in society. The landlords, the capitalists, and the workers. Landlords are earning rents. Capitalists are earning profits. Workers are earning wages. We bring all 3 of those groups together, the landlords, the capitalists, and the workers. We bring them all together to produce, let's say, this one homogeneous agricultural good, corn. Okay, so as you grow more and more corn, the land becomes less and less fertile, less and less productive. And what that would mean then, that if the workers are going to work this really bad land, and the capitalists are going to ask the workers to work this really bad land, then the workers are going to have to work harder. And the capitalists that are paying rent to the landlords are not going to want to have to pay as much rent to the landlords because the land's not that productive. And so we get, basically, workers earning less, meaning that they're going to earn as little as a subsistence level, and that from the perspective of the capitalists, because the land that's being worked is less productive, that they're going to pay less in rents. Which why, again, would a landlord then want to invest anything in having productive land? They wouldn't. And again, we can see this here. And here. So again, here's our steps then. You want from, if you're Ricardo, what you want is this, you want the wages and you want the corn prices to be higher so that the individuals invest in accumulating capital. And as a result, the workers become more productive and the population in turn then increases. And what you'd have to just make sure that you're doing is that you're not overworking the land. You're not extending out the cultivation so far that the profits fall. Right? But that would just be sort of the balancing act that one needs to engage in. And what Ricardo basically defended, because of his focus on agriculture, where he's then focusing on, is the fact that the profits that you get within agriculture are going to determine the rents that you get in other industries, in other sectors. So that's why the corn laws are so important to Ricardo. To have prosperity in the agriculture sector gets you the prosperity in the other industries. The rents you earn there in turn determine the rents you get for other capital goods. Now, Malthus didn't agree, which is surprising in some sense because Malthus did care a great deal about the agricultural industry. Malthus basically, the kind of long quote from his work here, was that the profits of the farmer no more regulate the profits of other trade than the profits of other trade regulate the profits of the farmer. Basically, Malthus had this belief that the industries were quite separate from one another. And Ricardo, again, disagreed. He thought that the, workers and just owners of capital in general get to decide on the industry that they're going to regulate, they're going to direct their activities to. And they're going to put it to the thing where they're going to earn the most money. And, if agriculture doesn't generate enough, then they're going to direct it to other things. For Ricardo, it is the agricultural industry that drives the profits for all the other industries. Schraffa kind of took up this idea of the simplification here. What he liked about it, and especially being able to focus on the corn laws, the reason why he liked that was because the commodity itself corn was a pretty universal good. And so what that does is allows you to de-emphasize how goods are different. How goods are different. You don't need to focus on the different nature of the goods and the labor that comes from them. That labor that comes from them becomes important for Ricardo because what he ends up ultimately deriving is a labor theory of value. And so in that labor theory of value, what becomes important for Ricardo is the unit cost of production and the value that the laborer brings to producing that product, to extracting that value. So this labor theory of value, I just kind of took I took elements of it already, so I kind of just put a placeholder here in the slides here. But from the classical theory of price determination, what we're seeing is that the classical economists do focus on this embedded labor in the products, and that this embedded labor determining the fundamental value of things, and that from there, what we see is that the market price can deviate from the natural price, that the natural price is based on the labor that's embedded in the product, but that the natural price also contains some element of the wages and the profits. What Ricardo needs in order to make things consistent, what Ricardo needs is he needs that labor within the product, that labor is consistently delivering the value, and that those wages in turn are increasing the profits. But to the extent that those wages fall, then the profits would fall. And in turn, what we would see is that the value of the product itself would fall. Now, Malthus again disagrees. So for Malthus, what Malthus again is kind of worried about is, do we have this glut of product which is causing the population to grow too big? And Malthus didn't think that you could have an expanded period of time where you had too much, because people with enough food would keep having kids, and that would mean that what was once a surplus would be eliminated as more and more people would exist. And Ricardo is saying, no, it is possible. It is possible to have these extended gluts. It would be possible to have too much of something for a long period of time. It would also be possible to have too little of something for a long period of time. So that's why you need to regulate things. What Ricardo does is he actually adopts what's called Say's law from Jean-Baptiste Say. And what Jean-Baptiste Say basically argued for was that supply creates its own demand. In this case, by virtue of the fact that there is production, that nature of production will create some demand within the market. And that for Ricardo, because supply creates its own demand, then what you would have from there is that savings creates investment. And as savings creates investment, then what we see is that the ones who save, the capitalists, they have to create a situation where they have to decide, how are we going to distribute our savings? What are we going to choose as the investments that we make? They're going to put it to the things that are going to generate the most rents. And again, why you're not going to overuse the land if the profits are too low. The only way you're going to get land to be invested in is if the profit rates that are captured from it are high enough. Okay, so when we start to put that together, Malthus, again, is seeing a world around him where there are these gluts, there's too much, and you can have too much investment, which leads to overproduction. Overproduction would lead to more people, which would start to eliminate things. And that, again, the Malthus solution was that you need to redistribute income to the landlords, in that you do that with a corn law, and that corn law basically fixes the situation. It redistributes the income to the landlords, the ones who are doing the consuming. Ricardo just thinks that you should let the market kind of figure those things out, rather than having a corn law artificially redistributing the income. So instead of thinking of this as one of redistributing it to the landed class, instead you've got Ricardo saying, why wouldn't you just think about this from a laborer perspective? So from a laborer perspective, what you want to do is you want to have an argument where corn can be cheaper, but as the corn becomes cheaper, right, you want to create a situation where the landed class has less incentive to keep accumulating capital. So the higher wages are going to mean that workers are going to focus on their own skills, and that the landed class are going to focus on not overusing the land, keeping their land productive enough. In the end of the day, it was Ricardo who actually ends up winning the day here. His arguments were a bit more consistent. And for Ricardo, what we end up seeing here is that it actually providing enough incentive for people to focus on being productive and making the land more productive. What Ricardo perceived that Malthus did not as well is that because you could make the land more productive, you could do this through better equipment, and that the only way you're going to get that better equipment to be invested in is if capitalists have an incentive to make those investments. And that would be where, again, the Malthusian argument starts to fall apart again, that everyone's going to starve to death. People aren't going to starve to death here, primarily because the machines are going to make the workers more productive. The workers are only going to become more productive, though, because they face that the capitalist faces an incentive to make the capital investments here. And so then we just have this kind of block quote from Ricardo about the appropriateness of making those investments in the capital. Which gets us again to this kind of last slide here about, Smith not really having a well-considered theory of rent, and Smith not having a very well-considered theory of why capitalists accumulate things. Ricardo's a bit more pessimistic. He sees this class struggle. He sees these displacement effects that machinery is going to have on workers. And for Ricardo, because he's focusing on all this disorder that's being created, what it means is that Ricardo needs to have a system in place where we need to have a system in place where the society is still managed, that disorder is still managed. And that's what Ricardo gives us with this theory of rent and his Ricardian system. It gives us a little bit better of an understanding of the struggle and the overall pessimism that would exist in that society.